Hey, deserving listeners, this is part 2 in me going over some ethical dilemmas. And let's talk about this one. This is a very interesting one. It is from an anonymous patron. She actually, in filling out the form, she gave me her name and said she wanted to be anonymous, but she also wondered if I remembered her as a former student of mine. And what I will say is, I absolutely do remember you. I think she was actually saying that she didn't think I would remember her, but I absolutely remember her. I don't remember every student easily anyway. I usually will remember if I see their face because I have a pretty good memory for faces. And once I see a face, then I often can remember a lot of other things about them. But when it comes to names and stuff, but I remember the face and the name. And when I saw the name, I saw the face in my mind. And I remember as a student, you were very thoughtful and smart and capable and talented. And so it's nice to hear from you. Going on here, anonymous patron, she writes, I'm a former student of yours from Antioch from way back, and I also learn so much from your podcast about not being a shitty therapist, so thank you. I'm curious about your thoughts on being a therapist in small communities, in this case, in the small community of the Seattle queer community. Okay, you're curious about thoughts about small community and therapists and ethics. And yeah, so as a caveat to all this, if you don't know, if you're not in our world as therapists, we have all of our ethical codes about dual relationships, meaning that whether we call them dual relationships or multiple relationships, what we're talking about is we want to avoid having more than one relationship with a client, meaning that we have one relationship where we have therapist and client. That's one relationship. We don't want to introduce another relationship like a friend relationship or a working colleague relationship, right? Like you go into business with each other, or you don't want to hire your therapist to babysit your kids because that's another relationship. And whenever you add relationships, it can be difficult to navigate. It doesn't automatically result in harm, but it makes it much more possible, much more likely that a client will be harmed by that. But it's a case-by-case basis. And in our field, we tend to think of this ethical area as a rule that you should never have a dual relationship with a client. But that's just simply not the expert opinion. When in doubt, don't. But there are times when it can't be avoided. There are also times when it might even be helpful. For example, I have had clients who will listen to the podcast. I don't advertise my podcast to my clients. I don't ever talk about my podcast with my clients, really. But they might find me after coming to me, and I don't think I've ever had a client that knew me from the podcast and then came to me because they were a fan of the podcast. And I think it might have happened once years and years ago, and I actually thought it wasn't a good idea because I thought interfered a little bit. But anyway, I've had many clients, not many, a small minority of clients who will tell me that they listen to the podcast occasionally, and I will talk with them about it because it's an important thing to talk about because it is a dual relationship. I have a relationship with the client as a therapist and client. I also have a relationship with the client in that they are a listener to the podcast. Now, some would say that's not really a relationship like a friendship or romantic relationship, right? But it is a relationship. I am in a different venue, and the client is hearing me talk, not as their therapist, but as a public speaker. That is another relationship. And I could harm the treatment, I could harm the client if I was not careful about what I said on the podcast. And I've always been concerned about that since the very beginning, 17 years ago. And I think about it a lot, and sometimes I edit stuff out, and I get feedback from colleagues and experts on ethics, and lawyers, and I also will get feedback from clients about this occasionally. And I've written a whole white paper on it, which from my understanding is maybe the only white paper that's ever been written. I mean, I certainly tried to find other research or other guides, or anyway. And it makes sense that there wouldn't be a lot of written about it, because there's not a lot of therapists that are doing this kind of stuff relative to the amount of therapists that are out there. Anyway, so, and among the therapists that are doing this sort of thing, not a lot of them are professors that teach ethics classes and are involved in pretty robust supervision, which requires us supervisors to understand ethics forwards and backwards. I've even been given the mantle of supervising supervisors. So, there's a high degree of expectation and responsibility that I have that I take very, very seriously. Anyway, so when it comes to dual relationships, it's complicated. It's case-by-case basis. But when it comes to a small community, then a lot of this has to be changed. The way we think about dual relationships, like, hey, if your client is a dentist, don't go to them for dentistry, right? But let's say you're and we've known about this since the beginning of the discussion of dual relationships, which would have been, I'm guessing, introduced 70, 80 years ago, that in a small community, if there's only one dentist within 50 miles and that dentist comes to you because you're the only therapist in 50 miles, then it's unreasonable to expect that the therapist is going to drive, to another state for dentistry. And if it's handled responsibly and there are guardrails put up, and that the therapist talks with the client a lot before engaging in hiring the client as their dentist, to make sure that the client can handle that, to make sure that there are rules around what is talked about and what isn't talked about. But the thing is for a lot of people, they don't really care. Our worries about this as therapists are often not shared by the clients. There are a lot of, particularly today, a lot of clients that are, like if I was in a small community and a dentist came to me and I said, hey, I would like to hire you as my dentist because I don't want to drive 3 hours to the dentist across state lines. How do you feel about that? Most clients, in my experience, will say, I don't give a shit. In fact, that'll be great. While you're sitting there, I might actually ask you a couple questions, and then I might say, no, we can't ever talk about it. You're free to say whatever you want to, but I'm not going to respond as a therapist if you ask me anything. And the dentist will be like, oh, bummer. So it usually people don't go. Now, having said that, we don't want to be cavalier about that. But what this emailer is writing in is saying, well, even though Seattle is a big metropolitan area with, I don't know, how many millions, a couple million or something, the Seattle queer community is actually a very small community. It's as if we are in a small town. So how do I navigate that if I am in the Seattle queer community? Okay, so going on. I'm curious about your thoughts on being a therapist in small communities, in this case, the Seattle queer community. I know there's a higher chance of dual relationships. I already discuss in initial sessions with clients and address what to expect if we run into each other. Just chime in here, so that's responsible of you. I would expect nothing short of that because you were a very smart student. Going on. However, I often find myself in a space with clients or people with my clients or with people my clients know or colleagues. Okay. However, I find myself in a space with clients, like in her personal life, she's at an event or something, and she's like, oh my God, there's one of my clients over there. Oh, there's another person that knows my client, like a relative or a former partner or something, or a current partner. And over there is a colleague, because, if you're a queer therapist and you specialize in that population, then you're going to have a lot of other therapists that will work with you, when you're working with colleagues. And so your colleagues will also be there, maybe even your trainees, that kind of thing. Anyway, So she gives an example here. For example, I was recently at a drag show, and one of my interns were there, and a recent former partner of one of my clients was also there. Okay. As another example, a client of mine started talking in session about a friend of theirs who I am going on a date with later that week. I didn't disclose to my client, or the date obviously, about this connection, but the proximity is a little jarring. Okay, so let's review. So she goes to a drag show and she sees, oh, there's one of my interns, meaning that she supervises interns, and there's that intern. And so that's not a client, but we also have ethics around interns and students and trainees. Very similar kinds of concerns. They're usually not as robust, but we also don't want to harm our trainees and our interns with dual relationships and other kinds of ethical concerns. There's also concern about confidentiality and stuff. Anyway, it's not as robust, but it's in that direction. And then she also says, a recent former partner of one of my clients was also there. So it's like, oh, I know that person. That person used to be a partner of one of my clients. Interesting. Another example, a client of mine started in session talking about a friend of theirs so a client says, oh, I have this friend named Jennifer, and Jennifer, Jones. And this emailer, this therapist is like, oh my God, I'm going on a date with Jennifer Jones later this week. Oh my God. And so she says, I didn't tell my client, like, oh my God, I know Jennifer Jones. And when I went on the date later that week, I also didn't say, by the way, one of my clients knows you. So she didn't say anything, but the proximity is a little jarring. Okay. So by the way, what you're describing, anonymous patron, is quintessential experiences in queer communities, by the way. And this sort of thing is talked about occasionally, but maybe not enough, because generally speaking, the people are paranoid about dual relationships. And so people, if you raise this question online or something, at least this is anecdotally my experience, is people will say things like, and I see this changing actually, but in the past anyway, people would just say like, well, you just can't go to events anymore because it's unethical to run into your clients, and you can't date that person. If that person knew your client and your client knows this person you're about to go on a date, you can't date that person. And that is, that's one way to do it, but it's not the only way. And there are ways to manage things. And there's also different approaches as a therapist, which I might get into. But anyway, now that doesn't mean it's all willy-nilly and everything's fine. It just means that a lot of care and perhaps upfront caveats or disclosures to clients, and maybe even people you're dating, has to occur. Not ethically to the people you're dating in terms of professional ethics, but just out of care for people you're dating. Anyway, going on. I am a fairly extroverted therapist, and I don't necessarily want to change my attendance at community events unless it's absolutely recommended. In thinking about this kind of overlap, I've also realized I don't really know the ethics about contact or relationships with people in close proximity to a client. All right, so just chiming in. Yeah, so on one hand, you're saying, hey, I'm pretty extroverted and I like to do stuff, and it sounds like also you're dating, just and you don't want to shut that down, which is understandable, right? And that's another part of the equation. It's like, well, if we want to be ultra safe, then yeah, you would no longer date, or you would only date people in another city or something. And every time there was a potential for a relationship, you would avoid. You wouldn't go to a drag show in town. You would. I guess it's like, I guess you would have to go to Vancouver, BC, or you'd have to go to Portland or something. I don't know, like to get far enough away. And even then, it probably wouldn't work entirely. But I don't know. So at some point, there has to be some give and take there. Just like, well, I want to be able to live my life, and a lot of therapists run into this, like if they start to online date, or if you're in the kink community or something, right? Now, it doesn't mean that all bets are off. It just means that things have to be careful. Okay. So you also say that you realize that you don't really know the ethics around contact or relationships with people in close proximity to a client. Well, it's all the same. The answer to that is that if you're in a close relationship, or you're dating the former, say you're about to go on a date with someone and you learn that they used to be married to one of your clients and they have kids together, then that would be a pretty extreme dual relationship, because you would have your relationship with your client and you would have a relationship to the client, in that the client would be in a relationship to you, in that it's like that my ex-wife is dating my therapist, right? So that's another relationship. So, if your name is Jane, then it's just like, okay, Jane is my therapist. That's one relationship. And also Jane is my ex-wife's current partner. So that's two relationships. And those relationships, it'd be hard to justify that, because that would be very close. Now, it can be done. And there are measures that can be taken to lower the likelihood of harm to the clients. And so, it's always important whenever we're talking about ethics that we say that phrase. We are trying to minimize the potential for harm for clients. We're trying to lower the risk. We can never eliminate that risk, but we want to lower the risk reasonably, as best as we can, of harm to clients. And when we put it that way, we're like, okay, instead of just following rules because it's unethical to do that, we're concerned about harm. And we can, I hope, imagine a scenario in which you did date. I don't recommend this unless a high level of concern was taken, or there was no other way. Like you were just like, oh my God, I'm so in love with this person. I can't, I just can't bear to not be with this person. Then I don't recommend it. But we can imagine, I hope, a scenario in which the client, the current client that you're seeing, would not be harmed if you were to also start dating the client's ex-wife that they have kids with. It's very close, and it would be hard to navigate, and there's potential pitfalls that could absolutely backfire you, right? Like if in the co-parenting scenario, your dating partner or your romantic partner and your client become at extreme odds, which happens almost all the time. I mean, not all the time, but very frequently. Then that would be hard to navigate, right? Because you would have your client coming in complaining about their ex-wife. Meanwhile, your client is thinking that you're biased one way or the other, I suppose, because you are heavily involved with the former partner. Now, can that be managed? Yeah. Can some clients manage that ambiguity? Yeah. That's another consideration, is like, can this client handle this ambiguity? Because there are some clients, like if you had someone with attachment injury that they were transferring onto you, then you have to be very careful about engaging into a relationship, which might mean that if you're working in the queer community, that maybe you don't treat people that have those sensitivities. That's just another thing of screening involved, trying to balance the whole thing out going on. While I don't care to have any relationship with the previous mentioned examples, I can imagine a scenario where I have a friendship or romantic relationship with someone who was close to with a client of mine due to the small community. Obviously, I'm very clear about relationships and romantic relationships with a current or former client, but if I include all of their friends and all of their exes, that would exclude a wide swath of my community and of email. Yeah, right. If you just follow the strict rule and say, okay, anyone who, because the other thing is you have to potentially screen out people who could be, former partners of clients or something. And what are you going to do? Someone comes to you and is like, hey, my name is, Jeff Goldblum, and I would like to hire as therapist. And are you supposed to, okay, have you, or do you think you ever will date the following people that I've worked with? As you can't do, that's unethical. You can't tell potential clients the names of all your clients. And so sometimes and this has happened to me actually. I've been in the middle of treatment, and suddenly I I learn that there's a major connection. It happens sometimes, and a lot of thought has to go into how to proceed. So it's hard. So what do I say? Well, I've already said a lot along these lines. The way to do it in terms of procedure is to have someone that knows enough about this scenario, either someone in your particular community who seems to have figured out how to navigate it, and can, or at least knows enough such that you can either hire them as a supervisor or consult with them. And you just bounce ideas off each other and you document that. That's important as a part of two heads are better than one. Or maybe there's 2 or 3 colleagues or something, and you all kind of, and you start to develop some kind of rubric around like when it is extremely unrecommended that this continue, and when it's, and if it is potentially okay to move forward, then here's the guidelines, that kind of stuff. That's a procedural thing. Not only would that help you, but it also would protect you from ethical complaints and lawsuits, because if you don't have that under these circumstances, it can make you vulnerable to being sanctioned and consequenced, because this is such a sticky area that for you not to seek active, ongoing consultation is a sign of irresponsibility. So, and also to not document it. Consult is one thing, and if you are sued, you can recall having consulted, and sometimes there can be an affidavit given by the consultant. So, yeah, we talked about this 2 years ago or something. It's much more robust if, like, I would say, 10 times is more robust if you actually document the consultation. And you don't have to have very formal notes. You could just have a Google Doc or something where every time you consult with one of your colleagues, you just write one sentence. It can literally you just put the date and the person, and you say, we talked about X, Y, and Z. And as long as you don't put anything in there that identifies the client or something, it can be helpful to not only just jog your memory, but it can help in a court of law, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so that's one thing. The other thing is that I think this might be where you have already landed, which is that when you're working with clients who are also in the small queer community, that everyone does their best to, including the clients, to make sure that everyone's taken care of, including taking care of their therapist within reason. So, for example, and this is kind of a weird area, of course, and it's each client is different, but I can imagine a queer client coming to you and learning that, oh, I think my friend is dating my therapist, and for the individual not to get up in arms about it, to say, well, we're a small queer community, so what are you going to do? And maybe even the person that you're dating, you have a real brief conversation and you just say, look, if I'm a therapist, as you know, and I see clients in this community, so I'd really appreciate it if you did X, Y, and Z, and that would really help me out. That's not usually what we talk about when we talk about dual relationships. It's really up to us, and it ultimately is up to us to manage. But you can ask for help, and in the effort of reducing the chance of harming clients, right? And so that's kind of an approach. It's also kind of a way that you hold yourself when you do talk with clients ongoing about this issue, which is another thing that this is another practice that I would do, and again I would document that. Regardless of the scenario, whether or not you're running into an ethical dilemma about this at all, I would every 6 months, as a matter of course, talk with every client about your policies, the risks, what could happen, what to do if this happens, what the client can do, where they can complain about you, or how they could bring this up, or here's what I do if I'm going to run into you at a at a drag show or something. Here's what would happen if I were to date someone that I later learned was actually a friend of yours or something. And you revisit that conversation. And, that could just be literally like 2 minutes with every client. This 1 week with all your clients, you spend two minutes at the beginning of the session and you just go over that again. Again, you document all that. That would help a lot, not only pragmatically, because it would help to protect clients, so it's informed consent, and it might also remind you of certain policies and procedures. It also informs people and reminds them, like, by the way, if we ever run into each other, blah, blah. But it also covers your ass because you're showing that you care and that you're doing due diligence to protect clients, that kind of stuff. Anyway. All right, let's take a break. Get back another email. All right, we're back from the break. This next email also has to do with dual relationships, sort of. It's from long-term middle tier patron, Danny from Australia. She says, I really enjoy the episodes where you discuss ethical violations from your insurance provider. I have recently been impacted by this with my own therapist, which I thought might be interesting to share in the podcast. My therapist, who I have been working with for over 5 years, recently received an 11-month suspension to her license due to a violation, and I'm really struggling with this. All right, so just chiming in. 5 years with a therapist, recently received a suspension of her license due to an ethical violation, and it's for 11 months, the suspension. She informed me of this suspension in one of our last sessions together. She told me that her suspension had to do with one of her other clients who was experiencing financial hardship. Just chiming in here. So if her license is suspended, then she can't practice. So if this was leading up to the suspension and she was going on an 11-month hiatus with you, or the license wasn't suspended and was instead reprimanded or was sanctioned in some way, like she was put on probation or she needed to do therapy or training or fees or something. But if her license was suspended for 11 months, truly, then she can no longer see you. And I don't hear that in your email, so I just wanted to point that out. But going on. She informed me of this suspension in one of our last sessions together. She told me that her suspension had to do with one of her other clients who was experiencing financial hardship. She offered him to complete handyman work on her property in exchange for free therapy. According to her, he began to believe that he had a romantic relationship with her, and when she attempted to end the arrangement, he ended up reporting her to the licensing board, and her license was subsequently suspended. All right, so just chiming in here. All right, so she tells you, and this is her account, so God knows what really happened, but it sounds like this is likely close to what happened, that she had a client who was experiencing financial hardship and was perhaps going to drop out of therapy because he could no longer afford therapy. And because she cared and she needed a handyman, she said, I will give you free therapy if you do work around the house. So just chiming in on that issue is that this is a dual relationship. And unless it's absolutely necessary, then it's to be avoided because there's a lot of other handyman people to hire, obviously. And there are other ways of getting people the help that they need, right? You can provide sliding fee scale. You can provide pro bono services. You can defer someone's bill down into the future, right? You let them rack up a balance and you acknowledge that you might not ever get paid, but once they're out of the financial hole, they can pay you. I've done that before for people, and I would say a good percentage of the time, maybe 30, 40%, I never get paid, but I knew that would happen, that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of options when you run into a situation like this that don't involve risking harm to a client. It also sounds like this client had a tendency or a risk of blurring boundaries themselves and mistaking closeness with a romantic relationship, or they had a propensity for romantic or sexual transference. Now, maybe the therapist didn't know that. There wasn't any indication of that, but that's just another reason why we want to be careful about this. Is it possible that the dual relationship with a client that didn't have a tendency towards romantic transference, is it possible it could have worked out? Yeah. Again, it's not recommended, but if someone takes all the measures and, like if the handiwork involved very little contact with the therapist, right? Like if the handyman showed up and did work on the yard or on a shed out back or on a fence line or something, and the therapist literally said, we're only going to communicate over email about this, and the therapist was ready to eat it, because one of the things that has happened in these two relationships is you'll hire your therapist to do something, and then the client, you'll hire your client to do something in this financial arrangement, and then the client screws it up, like they do a poor job or they destroy something on your property. And now you're in a position where you have to say, wait, I now need you to pay for the sessions that I gave you for free, or I now need you to pay to rectify the situation. And what if the client refuses? And what if you're wrong about the responsibility of it? But it can ruin the treatment, and that's why we avoid this sort of thing. Now, it's also possible that the therapist had involved a lot of the measures I talked about with the previous email about consultation and a lot of measures being taken, and that can work. It's also possible they're in a small community. It doesn't sound like it, but yeah, I'm guessing since they had a license sanction of some sort, whether it's suspension or not, then this therapist probably did not take measures to avoid harm going on. Just rereading so according to her, he began to believe they had a romantic relationship, and when she attempted to end the arrangement, I think meaning that, okay, let's end the handyman stuff and let's just go back to therapy, he ended up reporting her to the licensing board, which makes sense to me, which should have happened given what was happening, and her license was subsequently suspended. As someone so this is long-term middle tier patron Danny from Australia saying, as someone with some pretty severe attachment injuries, this was really triggering for me. I feel so overwhelmed that starting with another therapist at such a key time feels impossible. Thank you for everything that you do. End of email. Yeah, that is the question often for people in Danny's shoes is, okay, do I switch to another therapist or not? And am I at risk? Am I in danger? Am I in good hands? And so I don't know. I don't know the answers to those questions. And I'll say, is it possible that... So what I would ask yourself, Danny, is in the 5 years you've worked with this therapist, can you objectively say that it has helped you overall? And can you objectively say that by switching a therapist, that you would run the risk of never finding another therapist that would have the fit that this therapist has with you, or it would take years and years, and you would risk maybe never finding that person? Because that's, it's one of the things to think about. Because let's say that this therapist is at risk of harming you, Danny, but the overall benefit to you is so great and so helpful that the risk is worth it. That's the thing to think about. Yeah. But if you did fire the therapists, particularly if their license is suspended, I mean, that would be another thing I would ask myself is, okay, is it suspension? Because if it's suspension, are they taking a break from being a therapist? Because if they're still operating, or are they doing that stupid ass thing by just switching everyone over to quote unquote life coaching? Because that's a canary in the coal mine right there. Well, it's the second canary in the coal mine. The first one is that her license was suspended, and the second one is that she is playing willy-nilly. And even if she were helpful, the risk in my mind would be too great. So yeah, I'm sorry that happened though. Let's take a break. All right, this next email is from anonymous patron from Europe. She says, I've been seeing my therapist for almost 3 years now. He's great and he's really helpful. Sometime during the first year, he suggested that I might really benefit from group therapy. He offered that I could stop seeing him individually and join his therapeutic group, or that I can continue seeing him on my own, just less often, and join another, according to him, a very great and very welcoming group led by another therapist he knows pretty well. I went for the second option, and I keep seeing my therapist individually, and every other week I joined the group he suggested. Okay, so he offered that I stop, so I went a second. I kept seeing my therapist individually, and every other week, I see him individually every other week, and I join the group. I can continue seeing him on my own, just less often, and join another group led by another therapist he knows pretty well. Okay. It's going fine. Both therapies are helpful, but a couple of the people from the group also see my therapist as their individual therapist. Sometimes at the group, we share stories about our individual therapy, mention that we've already talked about a certain topic at the individual therapy session, or that we are curious what the individual therapist might say when we talk about something we shared at the group. Also, sometimes in my individual therapy, the therapist asks how the group is going, or if I want to talk about something from the group that I can really relate to or that I found interesting. The therapist never talks about the other person's perspective, only asks what the topic means to me or how I relate to it. I'm wondering about your opinion on this dynamic. Do you think it's problematic from an ethics point of view? Okay. Short answer, no. There is a mild dual relationship in that you have a relationship with your therapist as an individual therapist, but you also have a relationship with your therapist in a sense in that some of your co-therapy group members also have your therapist as their therapist. So he is your therapist. He is also the therapist of your co-group therapy members. And for some people, they might be thinking, well, is that really a second relationship? Is this really a dual relationship? And the answer is yes. According to definition, that is. I mean, if we go back to the very beginning of the discovery or the commentary or the concern about dual relationships, it was during a time when this sort of thing was very rare. You know, people would go to a psychoanalyst and they would never run into each other in public. There was no social media or internet. There was just nothing that you could believe as a fantasy that your therapist never left their office, you know? So that was very clean, obviously. Now, that wasn't always the case, even going back to the Freudian days, but that was, I guess, anything beyond that, then we start getting into areas that we want to look at. Now, as I said, is a dual relationship automatically a problem? No. It just means that we just have to acknowledge it's a dual relationship and we have to evaluate it and manage it. So I'm not. You're not being specific as to what you're personally worried about, an anonymous patron from Europe. You're saying, is this problematic? The answer is no. Is it unethical? No. But there is a risk there. And it sounds like for you, it's a little sticky because I'm trying to read between the lines. You're saying that you're in group and you will talk about, and your fellow group members will also talk about, I was talking with my therapist, Jeff. I was talking with Jeff about this sort of thing. And then you go to therapy with your therapist, Jeff, individual therapy, and you say, hey, Jeff, in group, Jennifer said this thing, and you know that Jennifer sees Jeff. And Jeff is listening to this and hearing things about his other client, Jennifer, and it sounds like he's very boundaried. He doesn't say, that reminds me of something I talked with Jennifer about. He doesn't even acknowledge that he knows Jennifer, right? But it is getting to him, and then by the time he gets to talk to Jennifer, or vice versa, if Jennifer were to talk about you in Jennifer's sessions, and could that affect things? Yeah, that I guess as I talk through that would be the main. If I were in your shoes, that would be the main concern. Although I would not be very concerned about it, but that would be if I did have a top level, the most highest priority concern, I would be, I guess, concerned that what if one of my fellow group members didn't like me, for example, and was talking shit about me, or misinterpreted something I said in group, like, I don't think I like my therapist that much. And then Jennifer goes to Jeff and says, by the way, anonymous patron, she doesn't like you very much. And then I get worried that my therapist is against me or thinks false things about me that I can't actually respond to because Jeff won't tell me what he's being told and that sort of. Yeah. That's the concern. And and I've done this kind of work. I've been in this kind of dual relationship before. It's a very common one, by the way, but I would, do a lot in my mind. If, for example, Jennifer were to tell me things about you, if I was Jeff, and Jennifer tells me, oh, anonymous patron has this problem, I would instantly recognize that as a dual relationship issue, and I would have two brains operating at the same time. On one hand, I would be attending to the client as if I didn't know anonymous patron and just responding and listening. But another part of me, the other part of my brain, maybe 20% of my brain, would be dedicated to categorizing and encoding this information in such a way that I don't let it harm my relationship with anonymous patron. And I've been in any therapist that does any kind of collegial work has been given the opportunity to have this this mindfulness practice, I guess you could say. It's just a cognitive, a professional, method or something that you just have to do. And so as I maybe later on, when I run into anonymous patron as my client, the anonymous patron comes in session, I will acknowledge, oh, I heard this bad thing about anonymous patron from Jennifer, and I have to compartmentalize that because anonymous patron, she didn't tell me that information, and so I shouldn't really know that information. So I need to compartmentalize it if possible, or I have to be very skeptical as to whether or not Jennifer was an accurate narrator about what happened. I don't know what happened, and so I'm just going to put that in a category of either I'm just going to ignore it in this moment, or I don't necessarily know if any of it is true, because I don't want to let it cloud my treatment with anonymous patron. You know what I mean? So, yeah, but that's pretty rare and pretty easy to deal with, even if it does happen. So, yeah, let's read another one of these. All right, this next email is interesting. Annual patron Matt from Texas, he writes in and says, a few years back, I was seeing a psychoanalyst for a few years and ran into some unresolvable problems with her, the psychoanalyst. One problem that always stuck out to me was that one of the first times I tried to leave her, I asked her for a referral to other clinicians, and she said she would look into it. But then when she came back, she said she couldn't find anyone who would accept me. The way she worded it actually gave me the impression she'd told them about me and they decided against taking me. I know this is at least deeply unethical, but is it legal? End of email. Okay, so let's review this. Seeing a psychoanalyst, not that matters, but it's a detail. And there were a number of problems that you had with her, which is unfortunate. And one of those problems was that you say, one of the first times I tried to leave her. That is an upsetting phrase, because either she was a tyrant or you knew you didn't like her treatment, but you, due to your issues, couldn't actually terminate with her, or circumstances prevented you, maybe specifically this lack of referral giving. And then she said she would look into it. So he's like, I want to terminate with you, and I'm going to ask you for a referral to other clinics. She said she would look into it. Yeah, it makes sense. But then she came back saying she couldn't find anyone who would accept me. Okay, so who knows what she said, but if we go off of what that description is, which, I can see happening given your overall description. You said, I know this is at least deeply unethical. Yeah, I don't know if it's deeply unethical. There's deeply unethical things like having sex with your client. This I would not put at par with that, because you're capable of looking up names for other clinicians. That information isn't unavailable to the public. But yeah, it is an ethical violation in that, regardless, under most circumstances, when we terminate with a client, we have to provide referrals if care is necessary beyond the termination. In a situation where we wouldn't provide a referral is if it was determined that the client was done with therapy, But yeah, particularly if they're asking for a referral and they're saying, I'm not done with treatment, then yeah, you got to give them names. I mean, I don't know the exact language in the various different ethical codes, but let's look it up. Okay, so a quick scan of the ACA ethics codes, which is usually the profession. I don't know the percentages, but if someone says that they have a therapist, usually they're a mental health counselor of some sort, like a licensed professional counselor or licensed mental health counselor, depending on what state you're in. And they would be typically using the American Counseling Association ethical codes. So that's what I'm looking at. And I like the American Counseling Association ethical codes. They're pretty robust and well written, and they've been vetted over decades and revised and whatnot and added to. But the code of concern is that of termination, and basically the code is that if termination is occurring mid-treatment, then before terminating, the counselor should provide a pre-termination counseling stint of some sort, whether that's half a session or a few sessions is dependent on the needs. And you also need to make appropriate referrals and ensure continuity of care, whatever that means. Like you need to give referrals, but if the client says, I am not likely to call any of these people because I don't know who they are, then you need to take reasonable steps as a therapist to help them to be convinced of calling the referrals. Or if they do call a referral and there are some important details that you need to pass along to the next therapist, you need to do that. So the ethical codes say before terminating, you need to make appropriate referrals. Now that can mean giving the names of therapists to the client, but it could also mean just handing the client over to a colleague, right? And of course, the client can choose not to take it up on that, but it's not necessarily providing referrals is the point. So, is it unethical that she came back saying, "Oh, I guess I should have looked at the American Psychoanalytic"? Well, no. I mean, so a psychoanalyst, in all likelihood, is either a counselor, a licensed counselor, or they can be anything. They can be, but typically they would either be a counselor or a psychologist, or they could be a psychiatrist. But they would have the ethical codes of their profession, whether it's psychology, marriage and family therapy, counseling, or whatever. And I'm pretty sure the psychoanalytic community has their own ethical codes that pertain to their specific way of treating people. Anyway, maybe there's probably ethical codes, American Psychoanalytic Association, but those are much less official because, anyway. So that is that. So using the ACA ethical codes is still likely, and they're very similar to all the other. That's the other nice thing about the ACA codes is that they're very similar to the others. So is it unethical that she comes back to you and she says, "Hey, I don't have, for whatever reason, I don't have any referrals for you." Well, regardless, so she says she couldn't find anyone who would take. So, I'll get to the highly problematic part of that statement in a second. But what should have happened is she would say, "I need a little bit more time to give you referrals," because to just say, "No, I don't have a single name of anyone that you can see." Now, this also raises another question of how much legwork do we have to do as therapists? Because for me, I can tell you that I have a short list of people that I refer clients to. They're people in the community that I can trust to provide good therapy. They are often former students of mine or friends of mine. I've referred a lot of people to Bob, for example, or I'll refer people to my own therapist, that kind of thing. And a lot of the times, the short list of people, which, the list might have 15, 20 client therapists on it, there's a pretty good likelihood that the entire list of therapists of 20 do not have any open spots. So how much legwork is it reasonable I'm supposed to do? And is that expected at all, right? And what I always do is I say, here are 3 names of people that I think would be good. And if they don't have any open slots, ask them if they know of anyone in their specialty that does, because they might be better able to know who not only would be similar to them, but also has open spots. So that's a problem, and how much is it reasonable that I should continually check in with these people? Do you have any open spots? And if they don't, then do I need to do outreach and figure, I think there's a certain, and then I would basically be doing just what clients could do themselves, which is just look on Psychology Today or just Google. And so at that point, there's that. So, and in today's world, now that I think about it, the ethical codes around termination and referral giving is really kind of outdated. I guess I would word it in the ethical codes that it is expected that upon termination, the therapist needs to take reasonable steps to make sure that care is continued. And that could involve providing referrals. But, let's say a client, I'm terminating with a client, or a client's terminating with me or whatever, and I'm holding myself to the spirit of the ethical code that I need to do everything I can within reason to help make sure that this client is, that their care is continued. Well, let's say that everyone that I know has no open spots, and I am now faced with just Googling therapists with this specialty in the Seattle area. And let's say I do that, and I say, here are 5 names. I don't know if they have any spots open. I can't vouch for them as clinicians, but I have enough data to tell me that there's a better chance that these therapists would be good for you than just random, just pulling a therapist out of a hat from the list. Or I could also see myself saying, none of my colleagues that I typically refer to specialize in your issue, and very few of them have spots open anyway. So I can't provide any specific referral. So what I'm going to ask that you do is you actually just here's the procedure of researching therapists that charge what you're looking for, take your insurance, live within a certain distance, their offices a certain, that sort of thing. And I actually don't provide the referrals, but I give the instructions and I follow up. In the next session, I say, did you look up any names? Do you want me to reach out to any of these people and kind of vet them? Or I don't know. I don't know if I do that, but and then if they're like, I'm having a question because I don't really know about this sort of word when they say this, and I'd help them, and then they land on one, and then I will terminate at that point, and I'll say, sign this consent for me to talk with that clinician, because then I can give them the rundown of the treatment, blah, blah. So that's not me providing a referral, but I am doing everything within my power, because the ethical codes come from a time when clients could not easily look up names of therapists, whereas today it's a lot easier. It's not simple, but and I guess in the ethical codes, the way I worded it, it's like, well, it's also expected that therapists don't just always tell clients, just Google it yourself, that they also take reasonable steps to try to have a group of names of people that they can depend on. I don't know. But, okay, so, but there's other part of it where she says, she came back saying she couldn't find anyone who would accept me. Now, again, I don't know what she actually said or what she meant by it, but you are interpreting it, based on the way you're recalling it. You're saying, the way she worded it actually gave me the impression she told them about me in a negative way, and they decided against taking me. Okay, so there's two sides to this. On one side, if we're giving her charity, then let's say that she accurately depicted you. She described you fairly to her other colleagues. Well, that would be good, because if other people are going to work with you, they need to know what they're getting into. They also need to be able to tell, if I were to do this, and this is actually very common, that when we refer to colleagues, we'll give a quick rundown. We'll be, there's this client, do you have room in your schedule, or does this sound like the sort of thing that you work with, that kind of thing. And that's responsible because it's assuring that there's a better chance of a good fit happening. And it also is the beginning of bridging the gap of treatment, so that the next therapist kind of knows what's going on. So if it was that, and the therapists all said, oh, I don't work with that issue. The client sounds like a nice guy, but I don't work with that issue. So it could have been that it could be just innocently that. On the other hand, given your suspicion is that she, which I have a hard time seeing, honestly, that she did the legwork by going to colleagues and saying, hey, I have this client. I was wondering if you could take him on. And then she proceeds to paint a picture that is so distasteful about you that the other colleague therapists are like, oh, I don't want to work with a person like that. I mean, maybe, it's not unheard of, I suppose. But the fact that she just ended it there, according to your story, that she's like, yeah, no, and the fact she worded it that would leave that possibility of being interpreted that way. I mean, if that happened, the proper thing to do is just to widen your search, or, as I said, come back and say, I actually asked colleagues and none of them have openings, even though maybe some of them did. But you just say that because you don't want to get into why. And you just say, so none of my typical colleagues that I refer to have any availability, or they can't open their schedule up or whatever. So what I'm going to do right now with you, I'm going to pull up my laptop and we're going to shop around for therapists. And, because I was going to do this before session, but I actually want to do it with you so that I can give you the tools that I would be using to try to find a good fit for you, that sort of thing. But to just end it right there and say, yeah, none of my colleagues wanted to see you, so tough shit. But having said all that, like I said earlier, you still have the ability to Google other psychoanalysts in my area, and there's a chance that that's all that she was faced with doing herself anyway. Who knows? But then you ask, is it illegal? And the answer is, as far as I know, in Texas anyway, no. It's not a crime, or it's not a misdemeanor or something to, our ethical codes are there to prevent harm, but they mostly have nothing to do with the law, which is a good thing. We don't want lawmakers getting involved in how we self-police, unless they have to, like in the case of conversion therapy, that kind of thing. Then we want, lawmakers, please get involved. But yeah, regarding termination, now, is there a suable offense there? Were you harmed in this way and others? Could you take her to court and extract money from her malpractice or something? Or could you complain to the ethics board? Maybe. But this sort of thing, I would imagine, would not be investigated. If you reported to a state licensing board, or and especially if you decided to sue her, I can't imagine, based on this, that there would be any sort of action taken. All right, well, that does it for that episode. Interesting. Thanks for emailing. By the way, Stacy, when she gets emails via the website, that's the only way you can contact me, by the way. is that, and the other co-hosts, is she will put your emails in priority order based on if you're a patron or a YouTube member, and particularly if you're upper tier or both. If you're both a patron and a YouTube member, it's sort of like being an upper tier of one or the other. And this seems kind of stupid to say, but sometimes she double checks to make sure people aren't lying, which sounds really stupid to have to say. But I think sometimes she'll get an email and she'll be like, this one sounds a little funny, like just content-wise. Let me make sure that they're actually a patron or a YouTube member. And so she'll look it up. So I don't know why I have to mention that. But anyway, so if you want to email in, then that's the way to do it. And that's how these people did it. And that's a weird way to end the episode. Let's do something else at the end here. I want to appreciate you and everything else that I appreciate of my life right now. My wife, the dogs, my family, the weather in Seattle has just been so beautiful. My office, I love my office. I'm very meticulous about setting up my office. I appreciate Patreon. I complain about Patreon, but without Patreon, it's a wonderful service. One of the things that I've been doing lately, my favorite podcast, TBTL, Too Beautiful to Live, I started listening to the very, very first episodes that were aired 17 years ago. Because I started listening to the podcast a couple years into the podcast, and I had heard about the early days of the podcast, and since those are available in the archive, I started listening to those, and it starts in January of 2008, and it is striking how different the world is from 2008. One of the things that I have noticed, because it's impossible not to notice, is Facebook has become known to them at this point. Not that I'm a hipster, but a friend of mine invited me to be on Facebook, I think in like 2005 or 2006. And for a good number of months, I remember there was only like one or two people that I knew that was also on Facebook. But I loved Facebook because it didn't have ads back then at all. And it was vastly better and cleaner than MySpace. I was just a little bit too old to appreciate MySpace. I mean, I had a MySpace, but it quickly became annoying to me. I mean, even people my age, their MySpace pages were just a mess of like automatically played songs and graphics and lightning bolts and like weird fonts and bad colors. Like the font would be like lime green and the background would be yellow or something. You're just like, what the fuck are you doing? Whereas Facebook, you couldn't do any of that stuff. You couldn't customize anything. And I also particularly loved the interface regarding uploading photos and tagging people, that kind of stuff, because that wasn't really available, I don't think anyway. The MySpace pictures, because I'm a big pictures video, home video, home pictures thing, and it's always a process trying to share pictures and video with people. It's like back in the day, I would literally email the video to people or something. Anyway. So I've been noticing a lot of things, and one of the things that I noted listening to these episodes from 2008 is they are very appreciative of Facebook and very appreciative of YouTube. They have yet to experience the negative side to social media, and they're just like glowing about social media. They're just like, yeah, they're at this point they're a radio show. They're like on one of the major radio stations in Seattle, and they're an evening radio talk show, but they're still, they're a big deal, and yet they're like completely jazzed because they have like 50 followers on Facebook, on their Facebook page. And they're just like, oh my God, we got 51. Did you see that? I mean, I'm not even joking. And I remember those days. It was mind blowing. And so to hear them, and today, Luke and Andrew, the hosts of TBTL, they would never talk positively about Facebook in today's world. In fact, they in the last 10 years. Like anytime the topic of Facebook comes up, it's either neutral or negative, And now I'm not saying I want to appreciate Facebook. I am fucking annoyed. I did a bit of episode not too long ago where I was railing about Meta and stuff and Zuckerberg. But at the same time, it reminded me of the miracle of social media and the miracle of the fact that I'm talking in my office right now and you're listening on some platform, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or YouTube or something. Like, I appreciate that on so many levels, not only as a podcaster, but also as a podcast listener. The fact that that exists, and today you just take it for granted. And to hear these people that are, not normally appreciative of things like this, talking in early 2008, just how much they appreciate YouTube having, they're discovering that on YouTube, people will upload old episodes of their childhood TV shows, like the intro song. They're like, yeah, on YouTube, this one user uploaded the Thundar the Barbarian theme song, and I was listening to it last night, and I was, it reminds me of a time when that just wasn't available. I mean, just imagine that. Like, there was a time when you would remember the theme song for Thundar the Barbarian, and you just didn't have the ability to listen to it. You like this vague memory. I think it kind of sound like this, and you were just like shit out of luck. There was no way that you could listen to it, right? I guess you would rent a VHS, but that's a pain in the ass. Anyway, so I appreciate Patreon. I'm not going to go so far and say I appreciate Facebook, but I appreciate Reddit. I appreciate YouTube. Oh my God, YouTube, there are some problems. Take it from me as a content provider. There are some problems for sure. Not only just with YouTube, but the culture and blah, blah, blah. But there was a time when that wasn't available at all, or no one was going to YouTube. There was a number of years where I would upload to YouTube, but people didn't go to YouTube for podcasts, or they didn't go to YouTube for psychology stuff, or they didn't go to YouTube for long form talking about anything. And so the fact that YouTube has worked so hard, now you could say, wow, they're a monopoly. There's always something you can say, but there's also something positive, and you just don't hear that. You don't hear people saying nice things about anything these days. And I get it on some level, but at the same time, like for me, this is, you don't have to appreciate shit. If you don't want to appreciate shit about shit, then don't, for sure. Everyone, do what you want, do what you feel. But me, I have gratitude for YouTube. I have gratitude for Patreon. I have gratitude for, I guess social media in general. Twitter, I fucking hate Twitter, but I know from people that I know that they love Twitter. And, they don't like certain changes that have been happening lately, but for them, they have a curated feed that they like, jokes about this or sports stuff or people they follow or something, and they love it, and you just don't hear people saying anything positive about anything. And that's fine if, you don't have to say anything positive, you don't do it, but I'm not saying, and it's funny I have to give all these caveats. It's so fucking stupid. Why can't I just have gratitude? Have gratitude for the bunnies that I see outside my office window. I have gratitude for the birds that are with all their spring songs. I'm pretty sure they're just trying to have sex with. That's always the thing. It's like all this bird chirping happening at 3:30 in the morning as soon as a glimmer of sun is happening, and they're just like, I'm horny, because isn't that usually why they're singing? But still, it's pretty, The fact that I was able to find a house that was still kind of in the woods, that's also in the Seattle proper, is I'm so grateful for that I can make my I'm appreciative of the sun that comes in the windows. I'm appreciative of Starbucks coffee, y'all. Starbucks. Howard Schultz, who stole the Sonic, or promised to keep the Sonics in Seattle and quickly sold them to Oklahoma. And yet I love Starbucks coffee. And I know for a lot of people that's so like basic B of me and corporate or whatever, but I've tried other coffee, and it's in terms of home coffee, I use the Via, the instant Starbucks coffee. And I have yet to find coffee that I like as much. Do I love that coffee? I watched the whole YouTube video, which I also appreciate, about how coffee, where it all started in Ethiopia, and then up through Saudi Arabia, and then to Turkey, and then to Rome, and then around the world, and all these words like coffee and Java. I think they all derive from the same, I think, Saudi Arabian word that they originally called it. I can't remember, but I'm appreciative of those people, those traders, those early people that cultivated coffee and also spread it around the world. I'm appreciative of the roads in my neighborhood, that they don't have potholes. Appreciative of my neighbor who finally put asphalt over the dirt area of our driveway so that it's not like off road every time we leave. But I'm appreciative of that. It's a smooth drive for the most part now. I appreciate my friends and my parents and my siblings and my extended family. I appreciate Bob deeply. I appreciate Berto deeply, and Rebecca. I appreciate you, that you're listening, and at the end of this episode that you would still be listening. I mean, it's such an honor to me. And I appreciate all the people that work on microprocessors to make all this possible. All the manufacturers and the researchers and the material scientists and the engineers and the supply chain people. I appreciate art and music and love and goodness. And I appreciate the subreddit Makes Me Smile, or Made Me Smile, where there's always love and goodness around the world happening all the time. Whether it be a cute thing a kid said, or someone who doesn't know they're being watched who's helping someone else out, There's so much good in the world, so much good in the universe, and so much good in humanity. And take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.